my name is Katie. Welcome to my channel, Duck Potatoes World. Today I'm going to show you how I hand knit 2 socks at the same time on 2 different circular needles. So what I have for you today, this is a sock that I knit on my sock machine. I knit the toe and the foot and the heel on the sock machine all the way up to where the cuff would normally be, and then I put it on waste yarn. And I actually have both socks done that way. And what we're going to do is we're going to transfer these from the waste yarn to 2 circular needles, and I'm going to knit the cuff by hand because the sock machine ribber and I still do not like one another, so I have been knitting all of my cuffs by hand. Now, when I do this, you do need 2 separate balls of yarn, 1 for each sock. Sometimes I will knit from only 1 ball of yarn, and I'll just use the center for 1 sock and the outside pull for the other sock. But for starting out, I recommend having 2. Here we go. Yeah, I would knit from basically both ends of the ball. But if you're starting out with this method for the first time, I definitely recommend going ahead and having 2 separate balls. It's just a little bit less tangly while you're getting the hang of it. So in addition to your socks and your yarn, you're going to need 2 circular needles that are the same size. So I'm going to be using US 1.5. These are my Chigoos. Normally I would do them either both on 16-inch or both on 24-inch. But when you're learning, sometimes it's easier to have 2 different size needles, because you can see here the needles are shorter on the 16-inch than they are on the 24, and that's going to be a visual cue for me to help me remember which needles I should be knitting with at a given time. Now, to begin with, I'm going to turn both of my socks so that I'm looking at the heel side, and I'm going to take the 16-inch needle and I'm going to find the corner of my heel, and I'm going to follow that column of stitches all the way up to the top. And I'm going to start by putting my needle into the first stitch. So it's a little bit easier to see if you use more contrasting waste yarn. But this is the first stitch of my sock yarn, and this appears my waste yarn. And so if you can see that the stitch here, this little V, right, this little brown V above this blue V, has a right leg and a left leg. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pick up half of my sock stitches by just the right leg, not the whole stitch. So there's a 72 stitch sock, so I'm going to pick up 36 stitches by just picking up the right leg of every stitch all the way across the sock. And you can see here now that my stitches are turning green, it's a little bit easier to tell where my waste yarn stitches are and where my sock yarn stitches are. Definitely, when you're doing this on your machine, you'll want to do a more contrasting waste yarn. I should have picked a better color, but that's okay. I can tell where they're at, so we'll be all right. So hopefully you guys can see what's happening. I get a little bit closer to the camera here, but I'm just picking up the right leg of every V all the way across the back side of this sock. If you miss a V, you know, it'll be, you could possibly drop a stitch, and you could possibly have the wrong number of stitches on each needle. So you do want to be careful not to miss a V, and to make sure you're picking up V's all in the same row. $28, $29. The waste yarn can kind of be in your way. 30. Almost done here. 31, 32, 33, 34, 35, 36. And you can check yourself by finding the edge stitch column here on this heel and following it all the way up and making sure you caught it. And I did. So now I have 1 sock on the 16-inch needle. Now I'm going to go to the next sock, and using the same needle, I'm going to do the exact same thing. I'm going to find the edge of my heel and follow it all the way up to my waist yarn, which will be easier to see on this sock since it's a better contrast. And I'm going to pick up 36 stitches on this sock, just the right legs of the stitches. So you can see this one a little bit better. So you're just picking up the right leg of every V for 36 heel side stitches. And I don't really count till I get kind of close to the end, and then I just count all the way across, because if I tried to count while I went, I would lose count anyway. So you can see those blue stitches I'm picking up next to the pink waist stitches. I gotta be getting close to 36 here. 2, 4, 6. You can see right here, I didn't get that stitch on all the way, so I'm actually gonna back up and fix it. Or I picked up part of the left leg is what it looks like I did. We don't want any split stitches or the wrong parts of any stitches. That's pretty important. (31, 32, 33, 34, 35, 36). All right, now you can see I have 36 stitches from each sock on each needle. Now these two socks don't have any yarn attached to them yet. They're not attached to each other. At this point, I'm going to turn my socks, and I'm going to do the same thing on the instep side using the 24-inch needle. You can see here, this is where my sock yarn is attached, but here is the last stitch that I picked up on the other side, and I'm going to go across to the next sock yarn stitch, and I'm going to pick up right legs, and there should be 36 for me to pick up across here. Kind of moving it down as you go. It's a little tricky as you get close to the edge, but you could do it. And sure enough, I picked up exactly 36 stitches, and you can see that the next stitch is already picked up on the other side. So now all of my 72 stitches are picked up on the first sock. I'm gonna do the same thing on the second sock. I'm going to start in the same place where I left off on the other side, into the right leg, 36 stitches. It's a little easier on this side because my waist yarn and my sock yarn are a better contrast. Trust me when I say this is actually the hardest thing you have to do in this process. Kind of keep that waist yarn pulled out of your way. Making sure you're picking up only the right leg and not both legs, and not splitting stitches and not accidentally picking anything up from the row below. Alright, that looks like that was the last stitch. I didn't actually count them, so I want to go back and count and make sure I have 36. But I should have 36. Let's see, 2, 4, 6, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. Yep, 36. So now I have picked up all of my stitches. Once I've picked up all of my stitches for each sock, I'm going to turn it back over so the heel side faces me, because this is the side I like to use as my number 1 side. And I'm going to take out my waste yarn. Just going to frog it from the first sock. If I've done everything right, it should just come right out and leave my sock stitches on my needles. And look at that, that looks perfect. So there you have it. You can see my socks, all my live sock stitches are on my needles. I'm going to stuff that little bit of a tail down in there, and I'm going to do the same thing over here on my second sock. Just going to frog my waste yarn right off here. Sure enough, all of my live stitches are caught on my needles. And I'm going to stuff this tail down inside too, because I'm going to knit my cuffs with contrast color yarn. So I have 2 balls of contrast color yarn. It's the same blue that I used in the toes. And I am going to be using each ball of yarn for its own sock. So this is the ball for my first sock, and this is the ball for my second sock. Each sock has its own yarn, and I want you to look too at how what's going on here. Each sock is making a circle with half the stitches on the back needle, which is the 24-inch needle, and half the stitches on the front, and then this sock is the same thing. I have a circle. So when you knit your socks 2 at a time, you have to be thinking both knitting in the round and knitting flat. Okay, so all of my stitches are on my needles. I have half of sock 1 on the 16-inch needle, half of sock 2 on the 16-inch needle, half of sock 2 on the 24-inch needle, and the other half of sock 1 on the 24-inch needle. Now, I am knitting both flat and in the round. Each individual sock is going to be knit in the round with its own ball of yarn, but I'm going to be doing it half a sock at a time. So I'm going to knit across here, drop my yarn, pick up my new yarn, knit across here. Then I'm going to turn my work like when you're knitting flat. And then I'm going to knit across here, drop that yarn, and pick this yarn up and knit the rest of the way across here, and then turn my work. If you find that confusing, don't worry. I'm going to knit several rounds with you and show you what I mean. So for sock 1, I need to get my ball of yarn that is just for sock 1. And I'm going to start by tucking 3 or 4 inches of the tail down into the sock. I'll be weaving my ends in when I finish. And then I want to make sure that I'm always knitting with the same needle. So if I'm on the heel side, I want to be using my 16-inch needle with my 16-inch needle. If I'm on the instep side, it'll be the 24-inch needle with the 24-inch needle. If you accidentally pick up the wrong 2 needles and knit, it's going to cause a whole lot of problems. So make sure you're using the instep, the same needle, like the 2 connected pieces should always be knitting together. So I'm going to go ahead and slide my stitches down to the end of my needle. So here's my left hand needle and here's my right hand needle. Now if you notice, if you were just knitting a hat or something regularly in the round, you would actually be knitting wrong side out, and that is kind of the setup for the way that this is going to look when you're knitting it. Normally when you're knitting, you'll probably be knitting like this. It's a little different here. It's going to be like knitting wrong side out, except the sock's not wrong side out, but the way that the needle is going to look that way. And that's okay. I'm making sure that my 16-inch needle is what I'm using for both needles here. And I'm just going to start knitting my ribbing. I want a 2x2 rib because that's what I want to do. So I'm just going to knit across in 2x2 rib. You could do whatever kind of ribbing you want. You could do 1x1 ribbing. You could do 3x2 ribbing. That is not relevant for the process. You can, I mean, I've knit cabled things like this 2 at a time. This is another great way to knit sleeves for a sweater if you want to get both of the sleeves done and make sure they're the same length, because you will not be able to knit the wrong number of rows because you're just knitting them at exactly the same time. I don't know if it's the fastest way to knit. A 9-inch circular single sock might be faster time-wise, but for me, if I finish a sock and then I have to go and knit the exact same thing again, I have a really hard time being motivated to finish the second sock. So being able to do them both at the same time means that when I'm done, I am done. I do not have to go and knit another of the exact same thing. And therefore, I actually wind up with a pair of matching socks instead of one sock whose mate never gets made. That is the one thing I don't like about my sock machine. I have to knit the socks one at a time. But it's so much faster on the sock machine that I've been pretty good about finishing mates. So you're just going to continue this till you run out of sock 1 stitches. And sometimes it's a good idea if you need to help remembering which is the sock 1. You can always take a stitch marker and just stick it on the sock on the side, like for sock 1. So I'll show you that here. I'm at the end of sock 1, the first half of sock 1. Very, very important thing. I'm actually going to take this yarn and move it between and under my needle because I was purling, so I'm in front. If I had ended on a knit, it would already be in the right position, but I want to leave it back here so it'll be in the right position when I come back to this sock later. I'm now done with sock 1. I'm going to come over here to sock 2, slide those stitches up where I can reach them, and I'm going to get a whole new ball of yarn, and I'm going to attach it for sock 2. I'm going to tuck down again 5 or 6 inches down into my sock, which is the tail I will weave in later, and I'm going to start my 2x2 ribbing for the sock number 2. And I'm just leaving sock number 1 and its little ball of yarn alone. I'm not messing with them at all. They're just hanging out, waiting their turn. Let's move that out of the way. There we go. And I'm doing the first half of sock number 2 now. All right, so now you can see I have done half around on sock 1 in my blue and half around in sock 2 on my blue. You can see that there. If you look at it from this direction, you can see the heel side are all blue stitches and the instep side are the main color still on both socks. Now, and my 2 balls are totally separate over here. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and put a stitch marker on sock 1. Well, here we go. I have a stitch marker. I'm just gonna stick it on wherever down here. All I am doing is just reminding myself which is sock 1. Now I am going to turn my work. And of course, when I did that, my balls are crossed, so I'm going to uncross those. Now the instep is facing me, and I'm no longer working with my 16-inch needle. Now I'm working with my 24-inch needle. And I'm going to do it exactly the same way I did the other side. I'm going to hold both sides of my 24-inch needle in my hands. I'm going to leave this yarn off to the side. Bring this over to the edge here. And I'm just ignoring that 16-inch needle that's holding the back, and I'm just going to keep on doing my 2x2 ribbing. Now this first round is going to be a little loose because I have this main yarn is very loose down in here. It's not a big deal. I can tighten that up later. It'll tighten up on its own as I go. I usually use 2 16-inch needles, but for beginning, for learning, it's a little bit easier on the 24-inch. You have some more room to work. And if you're using one of each kind, that helps you as like a visual cue to make sure you have the right needles. You don't want to knit with one end of the 16-inch needle and the other end of the 24-inch needle. That will not be good. All right, here we are coming up on the end of this sock. So now we have knit the second half of the stitches on the second sock. And just like before, I ended with a purl. So I need to make sure I bring my yarn between my needles and to the back so that it's ready for me to pick up when I get to that part again. Slide my stitches for sock number 1 back up here on my needle. And now I'm going to pick up the yarn that's connected to the first ball, and you can see it's coming out between my 2 socks and is ready. You can kind of see here, ready to be a knit on this other sock. And it's important to keep these yarns under the needle when you transition in order to make sure you don't add stitches in your corners. Now if you do accidentally add a stitch in your corner, once you notice it, you just knit 2 together and take it right out, and it's no big deal. And we're just going to finish this round, and then we will have knit our first round for both socks. And don't worry, we're going to go, I'll knit another round with you just to make sure that you get the idea. But yeah, this is how I do all of my hand knit socks usually. There are rare exceptions when I will knit 1 at a time, but not very often. I much prefer to do 2 at a time. Now when it comes to picking a needle size that matches my circular sock machine, I honestly don't worry about it too much. I just pick something and go with it. But if you're finding that your stitches are just way bigger than the sock machines or way smaller, you may have to try a few different needle sizes till you get what's right. But here we go. We have now knit around in each sock. You can see there's all blue stitches on the needles. And we've also knit flat back and forth. And so now we're going to turn it again. Move our balls of yarn so they don't get tangled. and we're ready to knit round 2. So we've turned our socks. We're going to make sure we pick up both of the 16-inch needles again. We're leaving the 24 ones alone. And we're just going to continue to knit in our ribbing pattern. My ribbing pattern is 2x2. You want to make sure that your yarn is coming out this way. You don't want the yarn to be like this, because then when you go to knit, you're going to be bringing it over the cord, and that's going to add a stitch. So make sure you're not over your cord. I'm going to keep going with round 2. Now on this round, one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to hold this 24-inch needle close, and after I knit my second stitch, I'm going to give it a good little tug. You can see this is really loose. That's the very first stitch, which if I reached in and tugged on the tail that I'm going to weave in later, that would tighten up. But this is, I'm tightening up the second round here. So I'll knit or purl 2 and then tighten. Just one little tug. That helps prevent there from being ladders where the 2 needles join. And I'll show you again when we get to the other side. Don't worry about this big loose thing. That is going to have to be tugged from the inside of the sock. All right, here I am at the end of the second row on the first sock. I ended with a purl, so my yarn is out in front, and I'm going to go under and behind and put down that ball of yarn, slide over to sock number 2, and pick up the yarn for this ball, and it's in the right place because we made sure we moved it in the right place before. I'm going to knit 2, and again that first stitch is really loose because it's not attached to anything down below. I can give a little tug, but I want to make sure after I knit the first 2, I'm going to hold that cord close and pull snug to help prevent there from being a ladder at that join, and then just continue in my ribbing for round 2 of sock 2. All right, so here we now have completed the first half of the stitches for each sock. Oops, sorry. So each sock has its own ball of yarn. And I've got 2 rows done here and 2 here. Now remember, I said this first stitch is just really loose, so I can go back inside the sock and kind of tug it up, pull on that and tighten it up a little bit. I'm not too worried about it. That will be a thing that I will fix when I weave in my ends. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and turn my work, and I'm going to untangle my sock. Now, after you get good at it, you can be just careful to turn your work back and forth and it won't get tangled. But while you're learning, I recommend turn your work and fix your balls, untangle your balls. I wouldn't try to keep in mind which direction you need to turn to keep it from tangling right now. Once you get the hang of this and you're not having to think about so many things, and then it's easy to remember. But for beginning, just turn your work and then switch out your balls and you'll be fine. And just continue right along. Make sure that your yarn is not going, oh, you don't want it to go over the needle you're not using. I'm using the 24-inch needles, so I have both my 24-inch needle ends. I'm not using my 16-inch needle. And I'm just going to continue right along. After I knit the first 2, I'm going to hold that cord close and give it a good little tug just to tighten it up there. And that will prevent a ladder at that join there. It's probably, if you're a magic looper, it's probably the same idea. I think you have to do that in magic loop as well. You could certainly do 2 at a time socks also using magic loop instead of 2 circs if you wanted to. That would not be a problem at all. It's basically the same process. You're just using magic loop. I just don't prefer magic loop. I'd rather have 2 separate needles. I know people who use magic loop for absolutely everything. They buy a 32-inch needle in every size and they seem to be able to knit everything that way. I like to own 400 different needles. Whoops, I accidentally only purled 1 instead of purled 2. I'm doing 2x2 ribbing, not 1x1. There we go. So there's not really a wrong way. It's whatever way works best for you. Here we are at the end of the second sock. Finish my purl 2 here. And then I'm going to make sure that my yarn is going under my needle. And put it down, and I'm going to pick up the yarn for sock number 1. Now if you forget and you keep holding this yarn and knitting with it, of course you're going to knit your 2 socks together, and then you're going to have to take it out because there's no way for that to work. So make sure when you switch socks, you also switch yarn. Very important. So knit 2, hold that cord up close and pull tight so that we don't have a ladder in between those 2 on the sides of our socks there. Now I'm probably going to do a total of 25 or 30 rounds for each cuff, because these are for Mr. Duck Potato. He has big feet. And I keep wanting to purl only 1 instead of 2. I'm knitting 2 without trouble, but I want to purl 1. I am doing a knit 2, purl 2 rib here. Okay, so we have now completed 2 rounds per sock. We're about ready to turn for round 3. So there we go. I'm going to turn my work. I'm going to swap my balls across so they're not tangled. And I'm ready to start round 3. And that's really all there is to it. You're going to keep doing that same process as long as you want. And then bind your socks off when you're done. I'm going to finish these up and then I'll meet you back here. All right, here we are back. I have finished the cuffs of my socks. So they are done and ready to give my husband. If you wanted to start a project from the beginning, knitting 2 at a time socks, you would use the exact same process. You can cast on directly half of the stitches for the first sock onto your 16-inch needles, pick up a separate set of yarn, cast on half for the second, turn your work, cast on the rest for the other side, go back to the first ball of yarn for the first sock and finish casting on that. I find that very, very fiddly and hard to do. Another option is to cast on both socks and then transfer the stitches onto the 2 at a time needles. What I usually do if I'm going to knit a pair of hand knit socks 2 at a time is I usually start either with the toe or the cuff. Either one is fine. And I will knit the first, usually 5 or 10 rows on one sock, set it aside, knit 5 or 10 rows on the second sock, and then transfer them onto the 2 at a time needles. So if you like to do toe up socks, you would get, about that much of your toe done for each sock and then put your needles on. If you like to do cuff down, you would do the same thing. I would usually knit like 5 rows of cuff for each sock and then transfer it onto the needles, just like we did with these machine knit socks. Only we had waste yarn. You wouldn't have waste yarn. You'd just slip the stitches right onto the circulars. So hopefully that gives you guys an idea on how I do my 2 at a time socks. I hope that you're finding all kinds of fun ways to knit socks. I love hand knit socks. My husband's going to love these, I hope. He likes them, and it's been pretty chilly lately, so he's been going through his. He needs another pair. I don't think he has maybe 4 pair of socks, so I really need to get with it and get him a few more pairs. We won't talk about how many pairs of socks I have. It's a big number. It's a really big number. So see, life is not fair. He needs some more socks. So I'm going to go give these to my husband. And I hope you have had a Merry Christmas, and I hope you have a Happy New Year. You guys have a blessed day and happy knitting.